Hi, this is Grover Norquist with Grover Norquist and the Leave Us Alone Coalition. The theme of the Leave Us Alone podcast is that the freedom movement in the United States is made up of individuals and groups, organizations that on their vote-moving issue, what they want from the government is to be left alone. You can think of the people around the room, around the table, taxpayers, don't raise my taxes, Second Amendment people, leave my Second Amendment rights alone, homeschoolers, people who go to private school, people whose number one issue is religious liberty. Whatever freedom is most valued by you and most endangered by the government makes you part of the Leave Us Alone Coalition. And today, let me just quick note here. The Leave Us Alone is both a video and an audio podcast. If you like what you see and hear, be sure to like and follow us on Facebook and subscribe to Americans for Tax Reform on YouTube. If you're more into audio podcasts, you can listen to Leave Us Alone with Grover Norquist on Apple Podcast and Spotify or anywhere else you find your podcasts. During this discussion we're going to have, feel free to post questions. We'll try and get to them on now, or we'll get back to you directly as individual. Now, joining us is Isabel Morales, the Policy Communication Specialist with Americans for Tax Reform, working on tax, healthcare, and tax policy, graduate of American University. She and Mike Palitz, the Federal Affairs Manager at Americans for Tax Reform, who is responsible for work on transportation, infrastructure, and energy policy. We're going to be talking today about infrastructure. If you've been following the debate on spending $6 trillion, which they say is going to infrastructure, you might get the idea that infrastructure is a French word meaning everything except roads and bridges. In point of fact, most Americans think that politicians are talking about roads and bridges, airports, pipelines, when politicians say infrastructure. In point of fact, would you like to spend more money is not a popular position. Would you like infrastructure can get you above 50%. And so politicians who used to say spending and then they moved to investment until people realized that government investment was another word for government spending, they now moved to infrastructure. My goodness. But when, for emphasis, now people are realizing that infrastructure is itself a code word for spending. But there is some real things such as infrastructure. Mike Palitz, could you walk through with us it may be dead or it may be alive, but the bipartisan compromise, when they refer to that as infrastructure, how much of that is roads and bridges and things we think of as infrastructure, how much of it's fluff, and then the other spending, the next bill that the Democrats want to pass, $3-4 trillion, unclear how much, what's happening there? Just I guess start with the infrastructure bill.
Sure.
Partisan effort at an infrastructure bill.
Your first point is obviously right. It takes about 10 seconds of looking at this to realize Democrats have done their focus groups and just realize calling their liberal progressive spend bag, an infrastructure package just polls better. Just everything that they want to do, calling it infrastructure, is pretty much what their approach has been. Now, I think you're referring to the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which is understood to be around $580 billion right now. We'll see. Things are a little tenuous right now in terms of it's a little up in the air how alive the package is. But it is generally considered the more hard infrastructure package rather than the larger $3.5 trillion package that Democrats are expected to shove through reconciliation. That instead, even though things are maybe considered more infrastructure, it's more wasteful spending. It's spending on things like government broadband. It's spending on things like electric vehicle charging stations. Things that, as we're moving towards a more electric fleet, the private sector can handle that investment and has been to this point. Go ahead, Grover.
Mike, Isabel, which one of you would like to handle the question of broadband? Because that's something that sort of falls in between. It's a real thing. It really exists. It's largely handled by the private sector, building out broadband or satellite capability to reach people. And yet somehow the government wants to get in on this, funding it and running it. Isabel?
Well, I think that's more of Mike's specialty.
Okay, then Mike.
Yeah, well, I think, Grover, you just touched on the key points. And I think, for us, maybe it's a little bit more of a tech issue than something Isabel or myself are particularly involved in. But it's as you just said, they sell it up, they dress it up as we're trying to extend internet access towards rural people in rural areas, when in reality, no, they're trying to switch people from private broadband towards government broadband.
I guess as I look at broadband, that can either be cable to your house, it can be satellite, it can be 3G, ground to ground. There are lots of technologies, and when the government says we're going to fund broadband, they mean digging things up and running cable out, which may not make a lot of sense to somebody who lives 50 miles out of town or in the middle of Wyoming. Do you really want to run cable out there, or would a satellite dish make more sense, or 5G? So as new technologies are coming along, broadband has been around for quite some time. Do you want to solve tomorrow's tech problems with yesterday or yesteryear's fixed investment? And then the other issue is we've had plenty of examples of local governments doing broadband infrastructure where they run or contract to do the broadband connectivity for everybody in a town or a city. And most of those have crashed and burned, costing a lot more money than they were supposed to. Some of them never quite finished. One in Provo, Utah was sold to Google for $1 because it was so in debt. Cities are barely able to fill the potholes. They're really not in a position to run a cable company. And so it seems very odd that somebody wants to throw government money into actually running these things and building them. If you wanted to subsidize a rural area to make it possible for them to get through, that would be the interesting challenge. Isabel, I want to come to you and talk about the funding of the infrastructure package, the various things they've thought of, whether even if they didn't make it into this package, they may be in tomorrow's bill. What is on the deck? How do they intend to pay for infrastructure, real or imagined?
Well, first is a flurry of tax hikes. So you have the corporate tax hike, a second death tax, capital gains tax hike, and then a really popular one lately has been IRS funding, which apparently will create $700 billion worth of tax dollars that they can go ahead and find through more audits. And the reality is that the large corporations, millionaires and billionaires, people point to in order to demonstrate this tax gap, they all have armies of lawyers and accountants who get paid a lot of money to ensure that their clients are compliant with tax law, using legal mechanisms to pay less in taxes. So when the IRS goes on a fishing expedition into these corporations and wealthy people, the truth is that they won't find much. As a result, the IRS goes after the layman. They go after small business owners who often run their own books and don't have nearly the amount of tax knowledge as large corporations and wealthy people do. And even if the intention of this funding is to get more tax dollars from the rich, that won't be the outcome because good intentions don't equal good policy. So luckily with the bipartisan bill, this is, according to reports, off the table now, but it's still a huge threat from the Democrats.
Well, Biden wants $80 billion of more IRS agents to hire 87,000 IRS agents on the theory that they would raise, how much money are they supposed to raise if they got all $80 billion and 87,000 more bureaucrats there?
Yeah, their estimate is $700 billion.
Okay, $700 billion.
And Grover, if I can add to that too, I'd say to these numbers, these estimates have been all over the place. They're coming from Dem economists. They're coming from the IRS themselves, which is obviously not a neutral interest in this conversation. It's the agency arguing for more funding for themselves. But it's one of the things that's possibly blowing up the bipartisan infrastructure deal right now.
Right. Sorry.
Well, the claim was the bipartisan agreement, the compromise, was to spend $40 billion extra on the bipartisan deal, and that was supposed to net us about I think $103 billion. And it seems from what we've been able to see, just looking at CBO reports from last year, that whoever was adding those numbers up didn't seem to be able to do math. I think the real number, the best case scenario from the CBO was about $40 billion less than what they were projecting.
And the high estimates are dangerous in and of themselves as well, because if the IRS is now told to go find $700 billion in extra taxes, I mean, that's when they'll really start their crusade against small businesses and the middle class, because I mean, if they have this audit goal, they have to find it somewhere, and they're not going to find it in large corporations. They're going to go after easier targets.
One of the challenges that Nero had as emperor was he needed more cash. And so he told all of the tax collectors out in the various provinces to go get more. And in order to get more, they became more brutal, more invasive, more abusive. And this makes everybody want to be part of not the Roman Empire, and leads to tax revolts back then, which were pretty violent things. But you really get, when you give tax collectors a free hand and tell them that you expect a certain amount of money, they will get it whether it's owed or not. And if the IRS told you, well, we're investigating you and we think you owe us, you think you owe them 100, and they say, well, we'd like 1,000. If you give us 1,000, we'll go away. How many people wouldn't take that deal? You know, even though it wasn't owed. And we see that when permitting takes place for things where the bureaucrats will give somebody a permit to run a pipeline across federal land or wires, and they meet everything you need to, but then they ask for other things or they won't sign the permit. They do this to Burning Man each year, which is a pet peeve of mine. The Bureau of Land Management extorts stuff from Burning Man. And in order to get the permit that they should have had simply for filling out the paperwork accurately and honestly, abuses of permit. Speaking of abusive permitting, Mike, could you talk about one of the ways we could get infrastructure to cost less is if we did it faster and the permitting took place sooner. What are we looking at in terms of dollars that could be saved, how much faster roads could get built? We just lived through COVID, where what was supposed to take 2 to 3 years took less than 9 months, and because they changed the permitting process to speed it up. Didn't change safety.
I'm glad you got the Burning Man plug in there too. I said good work getting the Burning Man plug in there too.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, but one of the things the Trump administration undertook last July was finalizing the rule of reforming the NEPA permitting process. Essentially, the environmental reviews that infrastructure projects have to go through before they can get their sign-off from the federal government and continue building. So part of the issue has been, despite Reagan administration regulations that were supposed to have this permitting process done within 1 year, the project timeline to approving permitting had ballooned to 4.5 to 5 years, and even worse on things we consider more critical infrastructure. I think the 7 years was the average time it was taking for a bridge project to be approved. So the Trump administration last year, they undertook some permitting process reforms, trying to whittle this down towards 2 years for their environmental impact statement process to be approved, saying the government only has 2 years, otherwise they get things moving. But we've seen this has killed major projects, not just infrastructure, mining. Pebble Mine was a big issue last year. It was something that had been going under its environmental review process for just about 15, 20 years. The left was just trying to kill it by 1,000 cuts. Unfortunately, it seems to be, it's still stalled right now. But a lot of the discussion that gets lost in this is just how long it takes these projects to get their approval, not necessarily the money, not throwing more money at it isn't going to get it necessarily built faster.
How much does that save if you're starting to build something and you've got the capital or all the things you need to build something and you're just sitting on them for a while? I've seen some rather significant estimates on how much that it can double the cost of certain projects. Do we have hard numbers on that?
I'm not sure if I have hard numbers in front of me, but I think part of the problem is I know part of the discussion in the past has been it's really hard to calculate. And you're talking about projects that never get built because investors get chased away, as was the case with Pebble Mine, with what we just talked about. So it's really hard to quantify even how costly some of this is and how it leads to some projects never getting built.
What are the lessons? What should people be looking for on this discussion of infrastructure? Because of course, talking about the Leave Us Alone coalition, people agree that a certain number of roads are useful and airports and so on. And I don't know that the government needs to build all of these things, especially since now we have so many interesting toll roads, and airports around the world are certainly owned privately rather than by governments. But there are some things the government needs to do or to fund. But we see this abuse of the idea of roads and bridges infrastructure bleeding into anything the government wants to pay for and make you pay for. and tell you that you want it. Hey, I gave you this free, college or free pre-K education. Well, that may not be something a parent wants. But no, it's yours. It's free, and we took your money for it. Not letting people decide what kind of education they want to pay for.
Yeah, I think our best estimate is about 13% of the first part of Biden's plan actually contained traditional infrastructure, which included like waterways, roads, bridges, broadband, all of what people actually consider to be infrastructure. So it's really, this infrastructure plan is really just a Trojan horse for a bunch of different items on the liberal wish list. I mean, really, the infrastructure plan could be better described as a healthcare bill, with the Obamacare premiums, public choice, and other healthcare items in there. Human infrastructure is really just a welfare bill. You're talking about refundable tax credits, all of these different items that have nothing to do with infrastructure. So you just take a really popular word that the American public responds positively to and put everything that you want underneath it. And it's a really disingenuous way of communicating policy. We have language for a reason.
Yeah, the term human infrastructure is such an abuse of where infrastructure literally means you're talking about structures, not people. And they turn that around to just try and encompass everything. And then more to the point that Isabel was making, the original Biden rollout, I think only 6% of funding was on roads and bridges.
Yeah.
You take that 6% compared to how they message it, it's obviously not an infrastructure bill.
Okay. Mike, what should we be doing moving forward as we have national debates on infrastructure spending? What can be done? What should be done? What shouldn't be done? What should they stop trying to do?
I think such a key part of this is educating lawmakers and the public on how our infrastructure system works, how it's funded. We're talking about more than 2/3 of the infrastructure in the United States is privately owned. The part that is owned by the government is overly owned by states. And how we fund that, a lot of it comes into this user fee discussion, where a lot of the main source is gas tax revenue. Well, I always try to explain to people that the way you pay your gas taxes, if you go to the pump, you're paying state and federal taxes. Your state taxes, it goes to your state, local level. Federal taxes go to the federal government, and all they're really doing is they're recycling it and handing out grants back to the states. But some of it, whether or not you're a donor state or a taker state, and at the same time, they're just siphoning off money that's supposed to, you're told is for roads and bridges that you drive on, and it's going to mass transit along the way too. So you're talking about 20% of your gas tax money going to fund mass transit, subways in New York and metros in DC. So the idea that it's a user fee is really also an abuse of the term.
And also, somebody mentioned in the Facebook comments the idea of Bidenflation. And if we're talking about this level of spending, we already see inflation numbers soaring. In the last numbers, I think consumer prices increased by 5.4%, and gasoline is up 45%. All of these different costs are soaring, and now we want to spend another $6 trillion in fiscal year 2022. It's just outrageous.
Yeah, and Grover, I think you had a great point you made, I think around 4th of July, where the White House put up that infographic that got rightly criticized for saying, I don't know how they put the numbers together, but you're saving 16 cents on your 4th of July barbecue. And it's like, well, you're not saving that cents if you have to drive anywhere and buy gas. Yeah. So I think that's a strong point to make.
They kind of cherry picked some of their products and then left out the cost of gasoline to drive to grandma's house, which has skyrocketed since they decided to stop more exploration for oil on federal property, and since they went after those pipelines, which are damaging to the cost, dramatically increases the cost. No pipelines, more expensive oil and natural gas.
If I can add one more point on inflation too, just the way the Biden administration does not seem to be in touch with the public's concern over inflation right now, is you're talking about these spending packages that are not just going to worsen the overall money being sent into the market, but it almost seems targeted to seem some of the more specific problems worse. So we're talking about the car market. Used cars right now are up 45% on year. Well, part of this Biden's infrastructure plan has $100 billion credits for electric vehicles, and then also expanding them to used cars. So we're saying, and think about that too, where it's targeted subsidies for wealthy electric vehicle owners. I think we had a number on it, but the average cost, I think, hovers around $60,000 for an electric vehicle. So we're going to subsidize, rich people's cars, so we can, while continuing to drive inflation for, lower end cars, used vehicles that middle class Americans purchase.
Yeah, and inflation especially erodes purchasing power when wages don't keep up. And based on June's reports, wages went down. So.
One of the things Democrats across the country have been demanding is higher gasoline taxes. Biden says he won't ask for that yet because it would violate his promise not to tax the middle class. He's, of course, already violated that promise in a number of different ways. But one of the reasons why the gasoline tax doesn't fund as much in roads as it used to is that they take a good chunk of that money and put it into big city mass transit, which is drivers subsidizing mass transit. Now, when drivers pay gasoline taxes, they have roads. It's not 100% match because somebody may be driving on roads that are already built and somebody may be driving on new roads. But at least the idea that only if you drive cars do you pay for the roads. And if you pay for the roads, if you drive cars, that money should go to roads. That money is being siphoned off in some states into general revenues and going into welfare. And in other cases, in the states as well, into everything from parks to bicycle paths to not roads. And then they turn around and say, well, we're short money for roads. That's why your roads aren't there because the taxes have increased. They increase the taxes, and then they again don't put it into roads. The governors of Virginia played that game 2 or 3 times, each time raising taxes, promising roads, and always doing something else. Then they come back and say, we still need money for roads because we stole all the money you gave us last time. Politicians know that people would like roads that work and airports that work and bridges that work. And so as long as they keep those crumbling, there'll be a demand maybe for higher taxes to fix those things while they use the money to increase the pensions of government workers who they hired a long time ago and who don't build roads.
Well, I think we should talk too about one of the, I think, most radical, insane proposals that, according to reports yesterday, is now being included in this $3.5 trillion package that the Dems are pushing through reconciliation, and that's the creation of a civilian climate corps, which I know Grover has gotten you fired up a little bit. Yeah. But we're talking about restaurants right now who can't find workers, and Democrats are out there talking right now about we need 200,000 jobs for all what I can see is basically environmental science majors who can't find work or don't want to find work. And we're going to pay them to come be climate activists who wag the finger at you and lecture taxpayers that are paying their salaries about climate justice and environmental activism.
Yeah, having people go around, they made fun of this when Carter wanted to do the same thing. They were going to have little energy Nazis going around knocking on your door and asking to see what your thermostat said, because that was how they wanted to save energy back then, because OPEC. Now it's a completely different reason. Not that we have too little energy. Now we have too much energy, and they still don't want you to use it. And they're going to have people going around testing that. And new announcement today that Biden wants to go around and make people shower heads. Don't give them too much water because he knows exactly what's a good idea for how much water should be used in your shower. And they're not just in your bedroom; they're now in your bathroom making these decisions for you. So It really is a little bit much. Well, last thoughts, and then we're going to say goodnight to the discussion of infrastructure, which is a combination of things the government should do and a much larger combination of things the government shouldn't do, or at least the federal government shouldn't be doing. To close up, Isabel, and then Mike.
Yeah, I think we really need to sound the alarm on the way that Democrats want to fund this, and also just the outrageous spending level. I mean, the spending level shifts the Overton window so far to the left, because when was a multi-trillion-dollar bill considered sound policy even just a couple of years ago? And then with funding efforts, we're talking about tax hikes that will hurt Main Street businesses, that will raise costs on consumers, that will overall harm the economy, lower wages, kill jobs. I mean, this is the last thing we need coming out of this recovery. And yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think, conservatives rightly should probably take a little bit of a victory lap on seemingly, according to reports, that the IRS enforcement, increased enforcement has seemingly to fallen out of the bipartisan deal. But at the same time, we know Democrats are coming right back for it in their $3.5 trillion package. It's listed as one of the pay-fors there. So it's still something we should be sounding the alarm on. And I would just add one more note on the Civilian and Climate Corps, because again, I think this is one of the craziest provisions that Democrats slipped in there. It's a massive handout to groups like the Sunrise Movement, the environmental activists. It's Grover, like you likened to, how they'll use infrastructure funding for pensions. This is just the same way. This is how you get Democrat activists on the government payroll. They mandate that 80% of funding doesn't go towards conversation. It goes towards employment benefits, including free housing for enrollees in the CCC, free transportation to work, free clothing. They'll be uniformed too, which is so it's basically the climate cops. It's just something we should really be sounding the alarm on. This is wasteful spending. It's not what people think of when they think of infrastructure. It's clearly not roads and bridges. The
good news on that is we got rid of the Civilian Conservation Corps over a 2-year period, phased it out because Congress had a commission, a committee, congressional committee, like any other committee, whose job it was to get rid of unnecessary spending. And the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and the works projects all got WPA, Work Projects Administration, all got phased out because they were such outrageous politicization.
It was actually the first New Deal program to be repealed by Congress.
Yes.
Very
progress. Okay, folks, if you like the content you heard today, please be sure and follow us on Facebook and subscribe to Americans for Tax Reform on YouTube, or subscribe to Leave Us Alone on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Consider rating our podcast and leaving a review. Your engagement with the show helps more people learn about it. Thank you very, very much, Mike. Thank you, Isabel. And thank you, everybody, as we watch spending, infrastructure, investment, all pushed forward by the Democratic Congress. And we'll see whether we can limit some of the damage. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.